For over 40 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is Build Situation Room. Once again, we must begin with Russian advances, with Russian gains in the southeast of Ukraine. 2 more villages are now under Russian control. We're reviewing the so-called proof videos from Russian propaganda. The first one is from Perebodova, and it starts, as is often the case, with the ongoing combat operations unfolding. That means the Russians not only show us the flag they raise at the end, but they also always show us which weapons they used, how they advanced, and which Ukrainian units they partially neutralized to capture the respective villages. We can see, it's again primarily drones being used, and interestingly, fixed-wing drones. That means fewer quadcopters, small kamikaze drones, but rather large fixed-wing ones, and we can see that in the much larger explosions that appear each time. We often catch a quick glimpse of these small planes, shaped like that, flying directly into houses and exploding. The unique feature of the fixed-wing drones is precisely that, of course. We can see it again down here, that there are simply much larger explosions with a greater payload that is inside them. And as a result, they have the capability to collapse all the houses where the Ukrainian soldiers are hiding and taking shelter. Now, we also see the flag being raised here in Perebodova, and what's typical for these videos is that they go out, showing us where they are, what they've captured here. We as Russians, what's striking and alarming is Komar soon appearing in the background. Perebodova is essentially just this very small village along the river. However, what we're seeing now is the city of Komar, and this town here on the left side. If we go back briefly, this city also seems to have completely fallen under Russian control, because otherwise they wouldn't have advanced north of it and captured Perebodova here. This whole thing shows us that the Russian army continues to advance in the southern part of the Donetsk region, in the southeast. They are increasingly advancing and reaching more areas within the Dnipropetrovsk region, located in the center of Ukraine. And Perebodova is just one of 2 villages that have fallen under Russian control. Nearby, there's a small village that shares the same name as the neighboring region, Zaporizhzhia. This village, though modest in size, has also fallen under the control of the Russian army. Back to the video we just saw. First, from a distance, you can see the massive impacts from the multiple rocket launchers. That means this is essentially the long-distance work being carried out by the Russian army before getting closer, before the troops venture nearer. And then again employing various drones, but also artillery, of course, to proceed against the Ukrainian defenders. We also see some fiber optic attacks in this region, though relatively few compared to other regions. Here it's more about heavy weaponry. On one hand, as mentioned, multiple rocket systems like the Grad, and of course the glide bombs being dropped by the Su-34s. But then again, and we see this repeatedly, these small fixed-wing aircraft, small planes that fly in here and bring the entire house down, or at least cause an explosion, thereby causing much more damage than, for example, quadcopters, which we typically see in use. Here, among the ruins and then further out on the open street, the Russian flag is being raised. Now we see it here, and the fact that the Russians can move so freely on the village's main street, you'll see as the camera pulls out. It's a very small village with just one street, and them being here clearly indicates they control the vicinity, making them feel safe here for a few brief moments. That means the Ukrainians are now further away and can no longer directly attack them here, at least with small arms. Now we're seeing it pulled out once more, and that's something that happens quite often in this region. That's the village we mentioned, just a road in the middle with houses lining both sides. These 2 villages have now been captured, and Komar, a nearby town, has likely also fallen under Russian control. Let's take a look at this on the map, and now we're zooming in on the southeastern part of Ukraine. And once again, we're witnessing these flanking maneuvers being executed by the Russian forces in this region. That means we're still seeing ongoing fighting, at least according to this map, and we believe that's partly true in the larger settlements of Oleksivka and Bahatir here. We've also continued to experience sporadic fighting near Komar. However, these new flanking maneuvers keep occurring time and again. That means the Russians are looking for a weak point, so to speak, in the Ukrainian defense, and they've now found it here, in this case, in the direction of Dnipropetrovsk, and have advanced quite significantly, pushing forward about 15 kilometers from Udratne along this road. From that point, the flanking maneuver begins, first advancing straight ahead as deep as possible. If the Ukrainians manage to hold them, attempts are then made to flank in all possible directions, such as toward the south. And that's exactly the challenging situation we're dealing with right now. Let's take another quick moment to look back at the 2 places we've just seen. One was Perebodova right here, specifically on the western side of the small river, which is why we can assume that Komar is entirely under Russian control. And Zaporizhzhia can be seen here on the map, even up here, very close to the border with Dnipropetrovsk. The Russians are advancing further, expanding their front here. We can see that. Again, there are ongoing defensive efforts by the Ukrainian army in this area. However, this area near the oblast border is still being defended or remains relatively far from the front lines. If you look at this here and this up here, the Russians are already very close and are advancing on an increasingly wider front, at least towards the oblast border, and could potentially, if they wanted to, by now already enter the oblast in the center of Ukraine over a length of approximately 25 kilometers along the front line. From Zaporizhzhia village, we head to Zaporizhzhia Oblast, the large southern Ukrainian region. Here, the Ukrainian army launched another attack, this time targeting a Russian supply convoy once more. As we know, in the south of Ukraine, the Russians have laid new tracks and established new rail connections to better supply, for example, Crimea and the occupied parts of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. And here, once again, we see footage from Ukraine provided by the Ukrainian intelligence service, which clearly shows that one of these trains, specifically a fuel train, was targeted in an attack using various small drones. The footage isn't ideal right now. I hope you can make it out. So this down below us is the train. And now we're seeing how one of these drones basically swoops down onto one of the tank cars here. It's clear now. The tank cars are all neatly lined up in a row. And there we see it now from different perspectives, just flying into it. The Ukrainians did it in such a way that they approached it from different angles. That means once the train had come to a stop, they then used additional drones. Here we see it, and here we can observe a newer additional tank being targeted in this instance. This resulted in the train catching fire at various points along its route. We are now seeing the footage of it and how it ended up getting stuck there. The Russians encountered a serious issue here. We'll see it on the left side shortly. Another explosion at a tank. Here we see it. At first it looks like it's missed. However, now we can clearly see that the entire situation involves another tank trailer, which has caught fire here and is currently burning up in intense flames. This situation is critically important for the Ukrainians as it directly disrupts the fuel supply carried by this train. On the other hand, it also blocks the railway tracks, which makes it even more difficult for the Russians to pass through here afterward, both for military and other logistical transportation purposes, also towards Crimea. On the map, we're clearly observing, as we've seen with the drones, small quadcopters once again in active use. These aren't fixed-wing aircraft. Instead, they're actually FPV drones, specifically radio-controlled ones. Component placement, which are believed to have a limited range of just 10 to 20 kilometers. The Ukrainians, however, successfully managed to carry out an attack on the train here in Molochansk. And Molochansk, we can see that when we look up there in the corner, that's essentially the distance we're dealing with here, roughly 30 kilometers away from the closest Ukrainian position. That means the Ukrainians managed once again to use these very small quadcopter drones in that exact way, to militarize and adapt them in such a way that enables them to strike deep into enemy-held territory. And precisely this rail connection, which actually comes from the east, that is from Russia, continues here towards Crimea and also towards Melitopol, that this connection could be successfully attacked and then also blocked by the Ukrainian intelligence and the involved Ukrainian units. From the south of Ukraine, we're heading north from Zaporizhzhia to Chernihiv. Here we have new Russian videos showing that fiber optic drones are now also being used in regions that were previously completely peaceful, where the Ukrainians had not expected them at all. Here we see a wooded area, and in this very forest in the Chernihiv region, located in the far north of Ukraine, we can observe how these fiber optic drones are on the hunt for Ukrainian units. We're about to witness attacks, specifically targeting civilian vehicles. We can see here that the Ukrainians have no military vehicles present, and typically there are no armored vehicles here either, because there are actually no combat activities taking place along the border. Nonetheless, we can observe that the Russians have now initiated, well, if you will, a sort of aggressive raid operation, deploying various drones and partly targeting terrain vehicles across the area. Even regular sedans like here, that's a Volvo on the left side. That means they are indeed very active and want simply because they have the means. Maybe because they have a unit at the border/front who's a bit bored, just to show like we're active here too. We can put pressure on Ukraine here as well. Here too we demonstrate that our claim isn't just limited to Donetsk or Zaporizhzhia or Kherson, but that we have a claim on the entire Ukraine, and in this case we can even target a small outpost like this one, which is located just on the other side of the border from us. But it's not only the Russians who are increasingly using fiber optic drones in forests, something that previously barely worked at all. With these new type of drones, the Ukrainians are also employing them. These are recordings from Lyman in the eastern part of Ukraine. And here we really see like shelters of the Russian army. I hope you can recognize it now here. So it's fairly clear the tree trunks were all stacked together. These are indeed heavily fortified installations underground, which are now being specifically targeted by Ukrainian fiber optic drones. As mentioned, something that was once impossible. You're near the horizon, very close to the ground. You're also amidst these trees. And yet, the Ukrainian side has managed to lay these small cables, these fiber optic cables, which are up to 30 kilometers long by now, tow them behind them, and also pulls them into this forest position here. All of this makes it quite challenging for the Russians to deal with effectively. Near Lyman, that is, in this large forest, the Serebryansk forest, they have barely advanced so far, also because the Ukrainians are highly active there, because the whole area is indeed a vast and dense forest, and because they manage to effectively, repeatedly attack the Russian positions. Here we now also see an artillery piece, which is buried, so to speak, sheltered in this forest, and now we see the drone approach, which once again targets this concealed artillery piece, this gun that has been strategically positioned here in the forest. This whole thing, as mentioned, results in less movement here, still on both sides. Precisely, these fiber optic drones make it extremely difficult for both sides to advance, leading to an even more intense, so to speak, positional warfare here around Lyman. Here we can see it very clearly again. That is essentially the barrel of the artillery piece because it has now been attacked here, and then the secondary explosions, or at least the impact explosions, meaning here the Ukrainians managed, using a fiber optic drone in this Serebryansky forest, to destroy a Russian artillery piece. From the east of Ukraine, we move to the west of Russia, to the Kursk region. There, the Ukrainian army continues to intensify its efforts, building pressure by persistently attacking the town of Chotkino, a small border settlement. They have also advanced onto Russian territory in that area and are making efforts to disrupt the supply lines of the Russians aiming to reach Chotkino. And what we are seeing now are very interesting footage because they are about 10 kilometers inside Russian territory on one side, and on the other side, the Ukrainian army is using barriers set up by Russia to set up ambushes against Russian supply lines. Barriers, which we will see in a moment, consist of dragon's teeth, that is, these tank obstacles, along with barbed wire, which is set up. And these barriers, which the Russians actually built to stop the Ukrainians from advancing, result in the Ukrainers knowing exactly where the Russian supplies are coming through, that he can only use the road here, which runs right through the middle. The Ukrainian drones are here, lying on the ground, waiting, until resupply arrives and strikes directly. The first drone has already ascended up here. However, we can now observe that they are actively attacking a quad that's arriving here. The Russians indeed have very, very few armored vehicles. We're seeing that again here. This is a quad bike with a trailer attached, most likely transporting food supplies, possibly ammunition, but that seems less probable, to the front lines in this area. And we can see that the Russians are now basically in a panic, causing an accident, trying to dodge the drone and end up driving right into their own tank barriers, which were just set up here. We'll have to pixelate some parts now because, well, these are quite brutal images that show us that the Russians are clearly facing a major problem. Now, as I mentioned, they've driven in here, and the Ukrainian drone is now zeroing in on the survivors from that from that first attempt to resupply, showing just how relentless the situation has become. The whole thing is interesting. We're now seeing the exact same spot, so practically the same tank barrier that was set up here. We also see the quad bike that's still lying there after it broke down, and now we see another Russian, in this case 2 on a motorcycle, approaching, and another Ukrainian drone, again waiting in the same spot for the Russians. It comes again about 20 kilometers or 15 to 20 kilometers inside Russia, and is now preparing to attack just as the motorcycle is approaching here. Same as earlier. The Russians spot the drone too late, swerve to escape, and end up crashing again. Here we see it once again. Maybe just briefly this time. So on one side to the right, that's the quad we just saw, which is still firmly lodged in there. And the other Russians now land right next to it. The Ukrainians here with the exact same strategy. A severely injured individual lies here on the ground, struck by the motorcycle, now under attack from the drone. The second one managed to succeed, the second Russian soldier pushing through this tank barrier and ultimately reaching safety, and proceed to move further in the direction of Chotkino. One final video we want to look at demonstrates that not only the Ukrainians are capable of striking in unexpected places, but the Russians can also still manage to surprise the Ukrainians with their attacks. We witness yet another Iskander M strike targeting a training facility of the Ukrainian military forces, and this attack, I think at least as Ukrainian observers also see it, should not have happened at all, because we are in the 4th year of the war. We are here near the front lines, and we'll look at the map shortly, in the small village of Davydiv Brid in the Kherson region, a place once occupied by the Russian army and now liberated. And in this village there is a visible maneuver, so to speak. Out in the open air, the Ukrainians are training here. We can see how all their vehicles have gathered here, how a diverse range of civilian vehicles have been collected and assembled over there. Now we see how the Ukrainians are positioning themselves. Here it is once again. So a larger group of soldiers positioning themselves in front of what might be a KAMAZ truck or another truck, essentially having a discussion or practicing something or something similar. Here we can even see that a semicircle has been formed. I think it's quite clear from the shadows here. So the commander and then the soldiers positioning themselves all around him. And all of this once again under Russian observation, just a few kilometers away from the front line. And of course, the Russians do what they can. When they see a larger troop concentration, they spot the vehicles here, and they've now marked them again. Here we see once again all the soldiers lined up in formation. And now an Iskander ballistic missile strike is being requested by the Russians, which is set to directly impact this particular area in just a matter of moments. And the whole thing we just learned about was basically, well, this area here down in the center, that's what we just observed. And we can clearly notice this really extensive radius that these particular elements here, submunitions, so the cluster munitions of the Iskander missile caused this here. And it most likely leads, as we can observe, some damaged vehicles afterward, presumably once more to casualties and injuries on the Ukrainian side. Which is precisely why many Ukrainian observers and also war bloggers criticize this open troop display. Let's take another look at this on the map and see. We're in the southern part of Ukraine, as previously mentioned, and the small village known as Davydiv Brid is situated there. Roughly, we can see here, what is that, about 50 to 60 kilometers away from the border, as it appears. Probably, if you pull it further east, it's even less, and in that sense, it's hardly a problem for the Russian drones here to advance this far into Ukrainian territory from the occupied areas. From Novakakhovka or even further east, and to monitor the whole situation. And in that sense, it was yet another, one has to say, avoidable attack by the Russians. Here, as we've just witnessed, there's no air defense system in place to counter this threat or to intercept the Iskander missiles. And in that sense, this OPSEC, meaning operational security, is actually the most important thing the Ukrainians can do to defend themselves even during such trainings. In this instance, unfortunately, it didn't work out. And once again, the Russians managed to bomb a training camp belonging to the Ukrainian army here.